So it makes sense that he went into much greater detail.
Dr. Aaron, I want to talk to you real quick.
Gospels. Time in history and the events taking place in very specific. We can get through this. Okay, my final on the Synoptic Gospels is covering some of the perceived differences in the Gospels. Critics have pointed out for millennia
2,000 years later.
The differences in the Gospels. But I'd like to point out a few things and hopefully dispel some of the misconceptions around this topic. First is that the good news, the Gospels, were given through oral tradition for decades. And so I think that if the written Gospels were any more similar, that critics would claim collusion or plagiarism. But then moving on, I think a lot of the differences boil down to the perspective and the emphasis given by each author of each gospel. But I'd also say, and maybe more importantly, that the differences kind of point to the author's intended audience in their writing of the good news, right? Matthew, in his gospel, wrote to his fellow Jewish people and spoke heavily of the lineage of Jesus, the fulfillment of ancient prophecies in the Tanakh, and the foretelling of the Jewish Messiah. Mark, who wrote his gospel or good news to the Romans, who had numerous false gods, spoke of the power and the miracles of Jesus and the sovereignty of Yahweh, and in turn his immortal Son to get the Romans to turn from their numerous gods and look to the Most High God. Luke was the only non-Jewish writer of the Gospels, and as a physician and a deep thinker, he aimed his Gospel primarily at the Greeks, who again had numerous false gods. So they needed to hear of Jesus' miracles and the power, but he focused his work from a physician's perspective. And Luke provided great accounts and insights into Jesus' numerous parables to this community of thinkers. So this concludes the Synoptic Gospels, seen as having nearly 90% correlation with each other. And moving on to John, who has roughly 10% exact correlation with the Synoptic Gospels, his account of the good news was written to all people. It was written to Gentiles abroad, non-Jewish people, who would have had little to no working knowledge of Jewish culture, history, religion. So it makes sense that he would have built his case, so to speak, from the ground up. We've got 4 different authors from different walks of life with 4 vastly different perspectives getting verbatim quotes from the teachings of Jesus. And I think this speaks to both the authenticity and the importance of the information in their Gospels. I compare it to giving a presentation on something as insignificant as red maple trees, right? If I were presenting to fellow Missourians where red maple trees are native, I would only need to cover mostly secondary details for my intended audience to understand, since they'd be pretty familiar with red maple trees, right? But it'd stand to reason if I was speaking with folks from the West Coast or perhaps South America that I would need to include some of these primary information, since the red maple trees aren't native in those areas, but maple trees are there. But then if you look a little further, right, like if I'm talking to South Africans, Australians, Indonesians, people from the southern hemisphere of the world, where maple trees are not native in any form, I would need to basically build my case from the ground up, right? And I'd probably cover facts that would have been overlooked or left out in the previous examples. None of these examples, although having wildly different information contained, would be contradictory, right? Nor would they weaken the reliability of the information in the other examples. And then if you figure having this information written by or presented by different people, the differences in the information given would grow, right? And finally, imagine I did this presentation on red maple trees. What are the chances that 4 spectators in the crowd would have identical recollection from identical points of view that day or a couple years or a couple decades later, right? I believe this kind of removes some of the problems in the Gospels.